I hear you saying to yourself, Brooks, what are you doing on the floor? Don't worry, it'll all make sense in a second. So ever since December 2019, I've undergone one of the most long-standing and difficult challenges I've ever undertaken, which is to create a new digital painting based on one of my characters every month for the trading cards in Biko's backpack. And I guess you could say the results have really grounded me. I've been floored, but there's not a good reason for me to be here.
Michael, get off the floor!
It's been 30 months and counting, and since I started this challenge more as a character designer and not really a full-on illustrator, trust me, there's a lot of things I've learned. Now, if only there was a setting, like this, with all of my work around it, that was a little more oh, right. That's much better. Number 1 is card number 1. This illustration of Jacqueline is where I drew her and the frog in their entirety first, without any plan for the setting that they were in. The thing that I learned is don't do that. I was so used to characters in a blank setting or in a simple little vignette that I took the comic artist's approach and thought, we'll add the background in post. Now, not only does this make it hard to make a cohesive image, both with regards to perspective and lighting, it just ended up taking a whole lot longer. When you're sketching out your scene, nothing wrong with establishing the character up front, but make sure you have at least a basic idea of what's going on around them. Move my water there, sorry. Number 2, on card number 2, this one of the Wanderlumen. I actually like how this came out, but the card itself is a bit too dark. The reason for this is when you're drawing on a screen like your computer or tablet, the colors are being backlit with white light. Once those same colors are printed onto cardstock like this, they don't have that same support. So make sure the colors you choose and the image you make will work well for their intended use. Number 3 for Beatrix here, audience participation time. I'll give you a few seconds to figure out the difference between this picture and this picture. Do you see it? So this is a mistake I made over and over in the first few months, but the card format is vertical and the illustrations are wide format, which means they didn't fit without illustrating an entire upper section so that the character wouldn't get cropped out. I did this no less than 3 times. Number 4, for Quilver, I began to understand the small seeds of what you can actually do with color and light. For example, previously, if a character like Quilver had an established palette, the one that you use on the character sheet or with turnarounds, those are the colors that I'd use in the image because they're correct. They're the canonical colors. But that's not how light works, and you can have a much more vibrant image, even subtly playing with the saturation of the colors. Also, a little blur makes for great depth of field, even within the character itself. Number 5, Ramsel is still one of my favorite paintings. This is where, with some help from artists that I was learning from, I learned that you can really make any image more dynamic, or I guess you could say dramatic, both with movement in the composition, like those little wisps of grass and leaves, and with higher contrast and value. That's good in almost all cases, and that's foreshadowing for my least favorite of these. Number 6, for Ennio, who I do generally like, I learned that just because you have an interesting character design, it may not translate to the most interesting pose. I think his legs here are a little uninteresting, and also because of a lack of contrast in value, he comes across a bit flat, in the space, I mean. Like the lower half of his body is not responding well to the more interesting positioning of his upper body. Number 7, Parcel. I learned a bit about translating those graphic comic lines and shapes into dimensional painted forms, like on her face. I gave her a nose that wasn't a little isolated bean, it's a regular human nose, but it's the same character. Depending on the style, you'll have to understand what those things look like as shapes and not lines. Number 8, for Koji. As far as process goes, I got some help with how to overpaint. So after you've made some general lighting choices with maybe something like a multiply layer or overlay layer, go back over top of that with another normal layer of paint, and you can start to really hone in on a good looking image from picked colors, and not just what the multiply layer creates. Number 9, Glangor, one of my least favorites, but I learned a little bit about using the compositional space to your advantage. So there's a POV of this shopkeeper's booth that's framed by the boundaries of the trading card. Also here, I realized it's okay to try and make an image funny, that's like a valid and powerful reaction to get from the viewer. I'm not saying that it succeeds, I'm just saying compared to the last 8 cards, this was a place where I realized, yeah, I can lean into that more if I want to. Number 10, Laven. This is where I manifested the true power of thumbnailing. Every important part of this painting started out as a quick and tiny sketch, and the painting is just realizing and rendering those elements, and it makes for a more striking and clear final image. Don't forsake the thumbnailing. Definitely have a full video on that in the works down the line. Number 11, we're only a third of the way there, Aetius. Turned out great. This is where intentional use of tangents and blending the motion and way that the painting directs your eye with both the character and the background really ended up being more successful. There's also graduated zones of importance here, again, mostly based off of value. Number 12, Biko, he blinked for this one, really unfortunate. In all fairness, I had him posing for like a good 9 hours, so he could have blinked at any point. So question, what is the most important part of this image? Well, it's the face and the hand. Another question, what is the highest source of contrast in this image? It's the incandescent glow of the hand onto the face. Everything else in the image is a darker value and clumped together in value, so it has less contrast. The face and the hand, high contrast, that's where your eye goes. Number 13, O'Leary. I relearned that painting a character does not necessarily mean that I have to make them more realistic. I regret a little bit making O'Leary so much more like a real possum and less like the original character design, which is more cartoonish. I know this isn't 30 regrets, but there you go. I also think the blend of brown colors and flat shading mean that this could have had a lot more dramatic lighting, like with some sunset conditions or something like that. Number 14, Jonadab. I think this is one of the stronger ones, or just one that I like the most subjectively. But I will say that this was a great reminder of cast light and cast shadows. There's a lot of mileage in this dark setting that you can get from the light of that little robot. This is the point where I'll actually hop in and say that since the start of this, one painting a month, it's basically been done almost exclusively during the pandemic. So Jonadab here was done during February 2021. Winters in the Northeast in our tiny apartment were pretty isolating and tough, and I think that a lot of how the person making a painting is feeling, or something reflecting their circumstances, can easily show through in the piece. And I say that to preface these next two. Number 15, Truael the Timekeeper, my second least favorite painting, and it's interesting, this is a character I had drawn plenty of times before who has a really strong read in a comic style, and I went into this piece with poor planning and overconfidence. The result is a murky setting, really washed out values, and an uncompelling piece overall comparatively. And hey, this is about the time we had to start looking for a new place to live because our landlord was selling, so I wonder if that's reflected in the amount of time spent on these paintings. Number 16, Myra. Welcome to my least favorite of these, and I think I've talked about this before. This setting that she's in is really poorly established, and the character's local colors match the setting, which makes for almost no contrast in value or hue. The pose is uninteresting. The idea of her goggles lighting up a section doesn't really come through. This is the one that I would want a second shot at the most. Also remember, home displacement anxiety. Gotta love it. Number 17, Blubford. Why not translate some of your stress into an image? This one I really liked. This was a design I reimagined for this Shackleton universe, and the lesson from this was to try and frame the image that you're seeing from the perspective of this character mentally. That's storytelling. That's making the character the narrator of the visual storytelling. That's conveying emotion with a clean through line. So that paranoia and anxiety that he's facing causes the setting to seem more eerie and scary. The guards have monstrous glowing eyes. And I think if I were to change anything here, I would probably go a little less ham on some of the rendering detail. I think it's excessive in some places, and I might tweak some colors. Number 18, Zonnet, was really fun. I think because I spent so much time on the character design aspect though, the painting is a little underbaked. I think it would have helped a lot to stage some trees in increasingly larger sizes overlapping one another so that you get some depth to this forest instead of what looks like a sort of burnt out silhouette in the background. I think in general I have work to do on making grays and browns look more appealing in illustrations like this. Number 19, Jamborella from Jamborellas. I learned nothing because he's perfect. No, I learned that it really pays off to have detailed backgrounds planned out, which I did in a mock-up separate to the painting, and to really take your time putting detail into those things. It makes the whole image a lot stronger because I really added painting to every element of this instead of just solid colors in certain places. I also found a really iconic pose for the character early on in the sketching and incorporated that right into the illustration since it doesn't really get much better than that. Number 20 for Inferglet, here's a question for you. What would immediately make this painting less interesting? You have a pinkish character on a pinkish background, and the answer is to get rid of the blue on his ears. The blue is just enough of a pop to make this piece interesting, and it contrasts with the warm fire tones as well. Number 21, N-Tag. This was a character that I didn't design before painting, for better or for worse. I sort of came up with the overall anatomy and structure within the pose for the drawing, and I think this ended up taking more time than expected, but I wouldn't necessarily discourage it. People are constantly coming up with the characters in the painting, and depending on your purposes, you might end up with something that serves the painting better, and doesn't have elements that are getting in the way of the final image. Unfortunately, the N-Tag model was tragically discontinued. It wasn't the vandalism, he stole a Sega Dreamcast and a copy of Jet Set Radio, and theft is unacceptable. Number 22, Goodwin. She's in a setting where she's in this alleyway, and the walls on either side could be straight up and down parallel, and that would be correct, but the illustration became so much better when the walls got angled in and more claustrophobic, almost like you're slightly looking upward at her on her garbage throne. Number 23, Glow Pup Axia. I think this really hit home for me how difficult painting a scene at night can be, or in this really dark environment. There's lighting choices you can sort of cheat, of course, but I think the result here has just some weird contrast issues, if I'm being picky, at least on the tail. And if you are painting something set in the dark like this, really have clear contrast and value structure. You can get there with moonlight, candle, or torchlight. There's ways to make it work, but there's a good chance it will be a bit more difficult than a daylight scene. Number 24, Budve. This is where I learned that you have to pick something stylistically. At one point in this process, I wanted to have the cake of realistically lit grass blades and the eating it too of a very stylistic Ghibli-style blue-green wash of grass. And the way that I structured this piece, I couldn't have both. In that case, I had reference of both of those things that I could sort of pull from, but not both equally. And I think we come up against this sometimes as artists where we, just because we like something doesn't mean that we need to or should be replicating it ourselves. And that goes doubly with process and technique and things like that. Number 25 and 26 are this Clobs and Wombat, and this is a point I've made before that bears repeating. Be careful about focal points. So this is a single image that was meant to have two focal points, and the result is a very muddy and uncohesive background. Not saying that there's a universal cause and effect, but that's what happened here. It's meant to be a less paranoid version of that same Shackleton setting as Blubford, but it doesn't work quite as well. It's really a matter of composition. If you need to, crop in to make your image more focused. Also, I think Clobs is a little over-rendered. Number 27, Avik. This is where I think for one of the first times I was able to more successfully have color themes between the character and the environment, where there was still vibrancy and contrast, the character's not getting lost, the eye gets directed through the image pretty decently, and there's a core action and idea that's being expressed. I think it's a character that's obviously very alien, but thanks to familiar personality and action that he's taking, the audience can connect to him pretty easily. Number 28, Naguana, was where I was able to translate 3 different kinds or modes of water. So you have the droplets that are in motion, the drops that are on the lily pad, those little reflective ones, and then the splashes and running drips down the character. And I guess there's the water of the pond, but that's just a solid blue. Here, I wanted to convey an idea more than a character, so Naguana is bound to the Inferglet and Budve designs thematically as aspects of creativity. The Inferglet is drive and passion, Budve is that slow growth over time, like vegetation, and Naguana is supposed to embody that much-needed rest that's an equal part of creativity. So my goal of making a really serene image here, I think, paid off. Number 29, Deputy Timekeeper. Back to the actual format and use of these trading cards, I was starting to feel like a lot of my detail and literal scale of these images was being lost once you shrunk them down to that trading card size. So I thought I'd try a human character that we could really crop in on. A lot of similarities to that parcel painting on translating lines into shapes here, with the added distance of not drawing this character for I think like 3 years by this point. Oh hey, we're at number 30 already. So for 29 paintings, my process has been rigidly similar. The same steps, the same planning. I'd gotten down to a certain rhythm, but it was also a rhythm that took a long time and wasn't open to experimenting or getting a very different outcome. So that you might call a rut. So my goal here was to change up the texture, the look of the image, go simpler, and try to get something that still felt like it belonged. So here the entire character is made using a gouache brush, so the edges are fuzzy, there's clearly lines separating out the shapes inside, and everything is pretty graphic up until that lighting pass with the music notes. And I have to say it's one of my favorite illustrations yet. So at this point, I'm not stopping these illustrations, but starting with number 31, there's some logistical reasons with the foil on the cards where I might need to change the design slightly. It's a boring, annoying thing where it voids the right to a reprint because of their new equipment if it ends up turning out wrong, even though the Harmona pillar had like 0 offset problems. Anyway, I'm using this as an opportunity in the series to kind of unofficially start a new chapter with them. It might mean that certain characters get revisited in new cards, telling their story in a different setting or time. What it definitely means is trying some new things process and style-wise. For example, I would love to try and make an entire trading card illustration in Blender with 3D. I can do it. I know I can. Definitely more things like this Harmona pillar and maybe some things that aren't so pristinely clean. That doesn't mean sloppy or rushed, it just means characterized with some of that painterliness that I almost go out of my way to avoid sometimes. As far as these cards, the best way to get them is through Biko's Backpack on Patreon. But for the older ones, as a few of you eagle-eyed folks have noticed, they were available in packs on brookeseggleston.com/shop. Right now, they are laying dormant for a relaunch that Tay has been working on. Look at some of these magnificent photos that she's been taking. So the earliest access to that relaunch, which will include the trading cards, hard enamel pins, stickers, keychains, everything like that, that will be to patrons and newsletter subscribers, so be one of the first to get a heads up when that launches. I'm also excited to announce that we'll have everything at Lightbox Expo this year, so come say hi. We're at a table with Ergo Josh, and we have some fun surprises in store there. Very excited to be a part of it in person this year. I hope there was at least one thing that you were able to take away from this insight into the process. I would encourage you to try and make a lot of work, not rushed or overwhelming yourself, but try and fail and experiment and see how much refining you can do over the course of that body of work. Whether it's paintings or designs or sculpts or stories or whatever. If you can do one a month, great. If you need some other pace or time frame, I'm not a policeman. You can do what works best for you, and I have no jurisdiction over your actions. What kind of things have you learned over the course of working a lot or over a large body of work? Things that you couldn't just learn by hearing, but more learning by doing. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. You can get my course Learn Character Design at learncharacterdesign.com. It's over 18 hours of a comprehensive character design curriculum. You can follow me at Bagel Denizen on basically anywhere but here. Thanks for watching and have fun creating. I think it's time for a nap. Just a little shut eye.